there is a new thing that I want to start doing in my video reviews for swords, and only swords specifically because it is born out of some research done specifically on swords. Now the thing that I want to add really, I feel, will give a lot better indicators of the quality and functionality of a sword than I think I could even express as an opinion, because it can actually be mathematically and scientifically driven. Now, there is a lot of objective aspects to whether or not a sword is of good quality, but I really do feel like the better we can try to understand the scientific principles behind it, then the easier it is, honestly, for us to gauge whether or not a sword is actually very good, at least in design. And this really is born out of this book. This is The Sword, Form and Thought. It is essentially, I think it came out of like a symposium of sword experts, Peter Johnsson being one of the main ones there. And Peter Johnsson is basically a hero of mine because his research on swords is absolutely fantastic, and I think his understanding of them surpasses pretty much everyone else in the world. Not to say there aren't absolutely fantastic swordsmiths out there. There are thousands of them, I'm sure, but he just stands out. He knows what he's talking about. And in this book, again, done with a bunch of other researchers, you have things like Peter's concepts on geometry and how it impacts the design of swords. And with that comes other tidbits of information such as typologies. If you've watched any of Shad's videos on the Messer and the Falchion, he actually talks about one of these typologies. He actually talks about this book, and he talks about the Elmsley typology for falchions and messers. And if you haven't watched that video by Shad, you need to go watch it. I mean, pause this video and jump over to his channel and watch his 5-part series, because it really is a great kind of foundational build and understanding of what makes a macer and a falchion and how they're different. Really, really good stuff from Shad there. And also, if you haven't done already, you should totally go to his Patreon page and give him a couple bucks a month. I'm sure he'll be very appreciative. But yeah, so this book is an incredible wealth of knowledge on the designs of swords and what makes them really good. But there's an aspect that's captured here in these pages, and I'll get a nice up-close picture for you, but it shows the designs of swords based on their length and their mass and the design of their hilts and the design of their blades and where their point of balance is and all this type of information. And it uses that to gauge how well the sword handles. I've been doing my own kind of off-the-cuff research, trying to figure out exactly how they measured some of these things. And I'm going to talk through some of that now. Reach back here for this sword, and we'll talk through it. So, if you've watched my channel, I know I've talked about it at least once, and I know that Matt Easton has talked about it before, and probably plenty of other people have talked about how to identify certain key aspects of a sword and where things like center of percussion is and point of balance and all that. So, point of balance is a pretty self-explanatory thing. You find the point on the blade where it essentially balances on your finger, if you can get it, roughly right there, right? And so you can find a point of balance really easily. You can also, there's a couple different ways to kind of find what people call the center of percussion, or the idea is the sweet spot of a sword. One that is suggested is that you kind of tap the blade like this until it feels a little bit more firm, and right about there is where that center of percussion is supposed to be. And I'm being careful because this is a sharp sword. You can also kind of gauge it other different ways. One that's utilized a lot, and this is actually covered in the book Form and Thought, is you kind of do this rotational movement on the sword, and you'll get this central, or they call the forward rotational node, right about here in this sword. And so when I hit, it's not quite where it feels like it's the strongest, but that's the forward rotational node. And you can actually also gauge, based on this research, the aft rotational node. You kind of do the same thing. You'll see there's a certain spot that just doesn't wiggle, doesn't move as much, and that's the aft. And so the idea is based on that, you can gauge how the sword will kind of rotate in your hand to some extent. Along with that, Peter Johnsson spoke to some pretty interesting things, and I'm going to link to a video in the description of his presentation at Arctic Fire on some of these concepts, because you should absolutely go watch that video. It's amazing. But he talked about the kind of vibration nodes, where they basically null each other out. So if I hit this on the flat, you can see it kind of wobbles. It doesn't really matter where I hit it, it's going to keep wobbling, but there are two places where it doesn't wobble as much, and it might be hard to see on the camera, but right around here is where it's not wobbling as much. And also, likewise, it'll be somewhere around the grip in the hilt. And you can feel it in the sword when you're hitting. You can feel it in the hand where it wobbles less than anywhere else. And also when you're hitting it, if you hit it closer to that wobble point, it doesn't wobble as much. So that kind of central, or that vibration node, as it were, is also kind of the sweet spot. Now sometimes that vibration node, right about here, will match up with about where you have that rotational node, that forward rotation node. And so when you're looking at a sword, you know, seeing those two close together can mean something. It doesn't mean that's the sweet spot and it's the perfect thing ever, but it helps you get some insight into how good the sword is and where that sweet spot may be for you. And with that, there's also some other concepts that were covered in Form and Function. It talks about the idea of effective mass. So if we say this sword is, I don't know, I'm going to say it off the cuff. I'm sure you could go research it and find out for my review of this sword, but if I say it's 1.2 kilograms, I don't know that's the weight, but let's say it is, then at the point of balance here, it takes that full 1.2 kilograms to displace the sword. You can actually just measure this on a scale, right? You set it on its point of balance and the scale will tell you it's 1.2 kilograms. However, that effective mass has a curve to it based on where you are on the blade. So the effective mass further up the blade towards the tip takes less effort to displace the blade, to displace the entirety of the sword. And so its effective mass is actually reduced. So you end up with this kind of like this camel hump curve where the effective mass curve is a little bit thicker, takes more effort in the hilt part, and the blade, it tapers off very quickly and takes a lot less effort to displace the blade. And you can use that information to say, okay, well, roughly at that sweet spot, at that vibration node where it takes, where you take less of a shake by hitting someone there, as well as it exerts, or it puts more of the energy into the cut instead of into your hand. At that point, what is the effective mass of the blade? And when you look at something, it's really interesting. When you look at something like a falchion, where the effective mass at the tip of the blade is usually actually much higher than it would be even for just an arming sword, you can see why they make such good cutters. I mean, right there you can see effective mass is higher, and that sweet spot where it hits is much higher. And that means you're putting more energy of your cut into your target and not into your hand. Really interesting stuff, and I don't know if I'm explaining it all perfectly. Again, go watch Peter Johnsson talk about it because he's eloquent when he talks about it. So you have this interesting curve that describes effective mass of the blade. And then the last thing you have is you have kind of a series of ovals and cones that describe how agile the blade is. Now that's the part that I haven't quite figured out yet. I've been able to figure out how to build effective mass curves, which is essentially wherever your point of balance is, wherever you want to measure that effective mass, you can measure it. Like if I want to measure the effective mass down here, I need to basically balance the sword at its very kind of back tip here on the pommel, and then way over here, and I can actually gauge the effective mass for that part of the blade. And then if I want to gauge the effective mass down here at the pommel, I do vice versa. I actually rest the tip somewhere and I see what the effective mass of the pommel is. And I have done this, and I'm able to build a comparable curve like I would expect to see based on the research that is published in the Sword, Form, and Thought. It's actually pretty cool. But the idea of the ovals and cones to describe the agility of the blade Haven't quite figured that out. So I'm going to go do some research. I'm even going to try to reach out to the likes of Peter Johnsson, see if I can get his ear, and see if he could kind of give me an understanding of how I can scientifically build those models. Because what I want to do is I want for every sword I review, I want to be able to take all these mathematical concepts and geometric concepts and the weights and the agility, I want to be able to present it in my review just like it's presented in this book, which is a nice picture that just gives you a snapshot that as you have the chance to feel more swords and actually test these things against swords for yourself, maybe we can begin to understand how these swords would feel just by looking at a picture. Now, I think it's kind of a lofty goal, but I think it'd be very interesting, and I really want to help perpetuate these concepts. I would love to see, and this is for anyone who sells or makes swords, I want to see these curves. I want to see a model for the sword published as a promotional aspect to say, you're going to buy this sword from Dark Sword Armory. Well, here is the effective mass curve, and here's where you can expect the point of balance to be, and that forward pivot node, and where you would expect to see the vibration nodes, all that stuff. Here's a picture. And I can look at that and I can say, wow, that's really similar to that Hanwei sword, and that's really cool. I might have to go pick that up because I really love that Hanwei sword. I want to see people begin to utilize this. This is cutting edge research. This was published in late 2015, right? So it's a little bit less than a year old. But in the world of swords, it takes time to get that out there. And I think this is the type of information that we've been sorely lacking for a very long time. And Peter Johnsson's thoughts on this is that swordsmiths back in the day, they didn't actually have a book published to tell them all this. They just kind of inherently knew it. And maybe we can get to the point where we inherently know it. As we kind of revive the use of the sword and its proper form and function, we might be able to get ourselves back to understanding them as much as a medieval bladesmith did, which I think would be really cool. So that is the thing I'm hoping to add to my review videos. It's going to be really difficult. It's going to take a lot more time because I have to sit down and take measurements for every sword I'm going to review from now on. And it's also going to take some time for me to figure out exactly how I'm going to present it, which is one reason that there's going to be a little bit of a delay in me getting some new sword reviews out there for you all. But I hope that the end result is totally worth the time spent in doing all this. So, very interesting thing. Again, just to note, you should go watch Peter Johnsson's video from Arctic Fire on some of these concepts. He doesn't cover all of them, but he covers most of them. And again, another shout out to Shad's video on Mesers and Falchions, because that was an incredibly good series and you should go watch it. I can say that Shad, I knew the difference between a Falchion and a Meser. I knew it before I watched your video, so it was kind of a win for me. But there was so much good information that I didn't know, and so many really interesting tidbits on what is essentially one of the more niche swords that are out there from the Middle Ages. So go check out those videos, and I hope to get you some really awesome reviews in the future. Thank you, everyone.